Hello and welcome to the next section, Authentication. At this point, our application is quite complete, but at the moment our database is completely open, public, and all the operations can be done by anybody who has access to this GraphQL server. That is nothing we want to put into production or anywhere into the cloud because it's completely unsecure and unsafe. To bring our application to the next level, we need to add authentication. Therefore, we will extend our existing server to add secure access to our database. Therefore, of course, the user will need to log in and log out. So, for our scenario, I will define that we only want to have authenticated users getting access to our database. Any other user can't see anything. And also you need to be authenticated or logged in to modify anything. So that would be the scenario we want to implement. And of course, GraphQL doesn't have any opinion about how we will do that. We have all the different options we can do when we add authentication to any Express.js server. And finally, we will also add the login and logout dialogues to clients. When a user is logged in, he should get a list of his own boards. This will be the new start page compared to the current mode where we defined to only show one board. Now we have the ability to easily extend our application so that the user can create his own boards and have a list of his own board. And additionally, of course, if somebody wants to share his board with somebody else, this will be also possible. We will move on and extend our server. We will add the authentication and user management. We will be creating Prisma Advanced project with the full featured server. Then we will discover all its parts and the overall structure. And then, of course, we will merge our existing database or data model, which we already are using, into the new one. And finally, we will also use the sign in and login GraphQL mutations to check if all is working properly. First, let's remind about our architecture we are currently using. There is this Prisma tooling or the Prisma server, which is currently serving our database. And that works quite nicely. So we have in a Docker container locally running our Prisma server. Say, to get this more secure, we will wrap this in another GraphQL server, which will have another GraphQL interface. So we don't serve everything and don't allow to call directly the database mutations. This interface here in front will be different and we have our own control of what we will make public. So therefore we introduce security, and on the other side we also will have an authentication gateway here, because for different mutations we will also require that the user has been authenticated. This will be done by running a login mutation. Just remind that we have to implement a new GraphQL server, which will then talk to our GraphQL database. The amazing thing now is that we don't need to start from scratch, because there is already some boilerplate. We used the same tooling when we created and started up our Prisma database. And now let's jump into the IDE and run the same commands, but create a more advanced. This was the old one. Just to have a short quick look into that, there was only this project containing a database and that's it. And we will now create a new one. We'll have the same file structure. Mainly there's this GraphQL config file. But let's move on and see what happens there. And I will create a new project called Coolboard Secure. And instead of creating just a database only project, now we switch over to creating a server using this full stack boilerplate. And here again, we now have a a bunch of possibilities, and we have to choose the Node Advanced, which includes the database and authentication, which we will need. So you can see this is just a boilerplate which gets downloaded, and actually it will also have some dependencies because it's based on the GraphQL Yoga, which we saw in the second section. Now we can also choose our target cluster. I will still choose the local one. We now get our database. So you see here we have a database schema, and it also created a new server, which you see here. We can now start a local server and open the playground. But before, let's check out and discover what's in the box here. So now what you can also see, we have the GraphQL config file. But now we don't only have the database section as we had before. There's this another service. But first here the database is now located in a database subdirectory. And here again we see that there's this Prisma configuration file and the data model GraphQL file. Prisma YAML file here just has some additional configuration parts. First, of course, all this cluster and secrets and so on, that's not configured here. But we have here the data model. It's the usual database definition which we saw before. That is for a specific example where an user, which can be authenticated, of course, by using its password and so on, can have different posts. We won't need the posts, but remove that later, and first move over and check out what's in this source folder. So when you scroll up, you see that we also have this package JSON, where is typically all the stuff configured for running our npm and node project. And actually, as I said before, there's this Yoga GraphQL dependency. Actually, we will run one of these scripts to get it up and running. But before we will deploy this and get it up and running, we won't need to have this entry of posts here, and even the post definition is not needed. So let's remove it. Then the next thing will be, of course, our application here. And compared to our old project and old database now, this will be more interesting, because when we have a quick look into that, we see that this is the standard definition for running our GraphQL Yoga server, which is here the GraphQL server. This uses the default values of the generated Prisma GraphQL schema here. So our database will be here defined as part of the context. So besides this Prisma GraphQL database schema, we also have a second schema. If I switch back, now you see here this pinkish GraphQL interfaces. So that are these two different GraphQL schemas. And as you can see here, this is a generated file by the Prisma tooling. This will be the file. Here we will have fine control of what we will want to have public. Maybe it makes sense to have a quick look into that, and we will also remove the post stuff. And as you can see here already, we have some user here with some posts, and also we have some extra stuff like delete post and public is not needed any longer, and also the query, we won't have any posts. For the moment we only have me as the current user. I will also delete the feeds. Now I will go into the console again, run our command for deploying the database. But now we will run our server. And if you have a quick look, you see that this will be running two different targets. It will be running the start and the playground. So let's try it out. All works fine. Basically, this is a playground where we can see that we have the application, GraphQL interface, and the GraphQL interface for the database. We can see that our schema should be fine already for our existing data model. Currently we only have the user here as a model, so therefore you don't see anything of a board. And the application has a different schema. Now you can see here the schema of the application, which is a reduced interface. So we have the current user. So now we will first move on and extend this existing schema to also have our current board schema merged into that. Therefore, we jump into the schema, and as we see here, we have a lot of sign up, etc., etc., but there's no board and so on. We will have to switch into the database model, and as we also see here, of course, we don't have any board, etc. Therefore, we jump into the old project and just copy and paste the old existing schema. And I will have to merge the user. So I just prepared to have an avatar URL, because it's nice to have some image or avatar representation for the specific user in the UI. So to get this updated, we will have to use the Prisma tooling again. I open a new terminal and run a Prisma command. Prisma deploy automatically detects changes. So let me scroll up again so that we can see what has been done. First, of course, it detected that we have now these new types, the board, the list, and the card. And also the user has this new avatar URL. And we should now have the new schema. Let's check this out quickly by looking into the playground, into the schema. I look into the database schema, and of course we have all our existing mutations and operations at the end. But of course our schema here for the application only has this limited functionality. We will have to dive into the server and figure out how we can add some stuff and how we can also use the current existing sign up and login. Let's figure out, and therefore opening the server implementation again. Here in the project view makes it easier to see what happens. We will have the index here, which defines the type def, so the schema, and also the resolvers. Both are things we learned already in section 2, I think. But let's make it incrementally and add the specific queries we need to our system. Therefore, I go into the specification here of our GraphQL schema. There are query section and mutation section, and also we will have to adapt the query. So let's jump into the query directly. And as you see, I already commented out the stuff we had before, and so that you can see a little bit how the structure would look like, we will need to implement these resolvers. But how do the resolver look like? What we want to query? Let's jump quickly back to the database and see how the generated Prisma GraphQL looks like. And of course we have all these type definitions, and I will search for the query. And here we have a nice compact list of all the queries and so on. Actually, we will want to show the board. So of course we will need to have this query here. I copy this over. I will add this board query now. Of course we will also need now a board resolve. Let's jump back to the resolvers, and I will just add this board resolver. That should be quite simple. I might easily copy and paste that stuff here. So now you will see in a second how easy it is to use this existing type system and Prisma binding, where I just need to have this Prisma database which provides us a query, and when it's the board query directly, then I can here put a board, and that will be referencing the board query from the database schema, and anything else will not be needed here except the ID, because we want to show a specific board with this given ID. That is only the resolver here, but in the schema we will also need to import or to define the board. That will be done by a specific import. So this line just grabs the board type from the generated GraphQL schema. That's just nice, because otherwise we would have to copy it, and it would be similar like this user here, where we define a specific type. If you are looking into the playground now, and you see here we now have the board resolver implemented. At the moment we don't have any board, so that doesn't give any result back, and we will have to manually create a simple board. Since we don't have any existing user, so that is something we will now create by using a new mutation. I will prepare this in a second. We need to run this sign up process by creating user in the background, and here therefore I'm running this mutation. I prepared this for creating my user, so it's basically robot. And the very interesting thing is here that we get this token back. We will later use this to authenticate, and if I also would run now with me, at the moment I'm not authenticated. That is something where we would have to use HTTP headers, which you see here in the bottom. And if I'm directly using this token here, and you will see in a second, and we will do this later again, just to give you a short impression about how this works. So now, by authenticating with this new token in this HTTP header here, we will have an authenticated request. Finally, we can do one last thing. I used the Prisma export, so now we have the possibility to run Prisma import also for where our backup file is located. And that was just our coolboard database which we had before. And there is this export something file. It automatically adds lists and relationships and so on. And then I'm now switching back to the database. Now you can see we have this board again. If I'm using this specific ID, finally I will also have our board fetched with the new application server which we have in front of our database. So in this video we saw how we could create a new project which also brought us this additional server, which is our wrapper or gate in front of our existing database. And we also saw how we can wire up the specific query so that our new GraphQL server fetches the specific information from the database. So we basically reused our existing database schema and have now some authentication. You will see that in the next videos how we can use all this authentication. So therefore we will add specific queries on the server side, but first, step by step, we will implement something on the client side so that we can also make use of this new feature